I had a presentation also. Hello, good afternoon. Of course, they can also see us. Oh, yeah, yes. They can see us. I have just 2 minutes. Just 2 minutes. So we're waiting for Taylor and then Daniel. You want to speak? Hi, can you hear us?
Okay, I can hear you now. Thank you.
So, you're all welcome, Daniel. Welcome. About cycle, fishing, or kites, from temporary Africa. And 2024. What will be next? Languages and culture. University and contributed at the international and the professional university. And also worked in Nigeria. And as a lecturer at Nigeria. Is a research at post-colonial African American war and literature, popular culture, and human rights. His research and teaching emphasize the celebration of differences. And as he often says, his research informs what he teaches, and what he teaches inspires what he writes, what he researches, So, um, he is a recipient of Faculty of Arts Outstanding Scholar Award for the 2024-2025 academic session at Mount Royal University. He initiated the African Black Writings in Canada series, enhancing EDI, equality, diversity, and inclusion via stories and conversations, also at Mount Royal University. He has published essays on African and Black literatures in international journals, and Just give a good example. Some examples: child soldier narratives and the underrepresentation of females in fighting forces, war, childhood, and trauma in African fiction, the poetics of memory in African diaspora writing, um, contemporary African literature, a critical analysis, the signifying fighter, Afro-pessimism in Dongala's Johnny Mardell. A Tale of Two Fighters, images of child soldiers in Jewish and African child soldier narratives. Reimagining nationhood in African literature, and notes on the nervous condition of Black and African immigrants in Canada. Of course, as I said earlier, it has a book which we're going to talk about this afternoon, Representation of Child Soldiers in Contemporary African Narratives. Examines literary geographies and worldling practices that underpin African Afro-diasporic literature, literary archives, and cultural forms, theorizing the textual atlas of Black life world and spotlighting the mediation between visual and spatial epistem in indigenous thought. And her PhD in comparative literature. And she studied for her undergraduate degree at the University of Uyo, Nigeria, and her master's degree in English literature, University of Ilorin, so in Nigeria. Her research interests: African literature, critical theory, global Black studies, cultural imaginaries and representation, visual cultures, diaspora and migration studies, digital humanities. She too has published quite a number of papers. One is Insights from Aworan, Yoruba Epistemologies and the Limits of Cartesian Vision in Tejuko's Open City. Transcoded subjectivities animate materiality, space, and identity in African women science fiction. The third discussant is Chris Uma, an associate professor, English, at College of Art, Duke University. He had taught at the University of Cape Town after obtaining his doctoral degree at the University of Witwatersrand, Johannesburg, South Africa, in 2011. He's a social entrepreneur, researcher, youth mentor, peace ambassador. He enjoys working with young people. He has great passion to help youth comprehend challenges they face in everyday life and consequently acquire knowledge, skills to enable them to make informed choices and live more productive and satisfying lives. His research interests include childhood studies, contemporary African and African diasporic literature, African popular culture, Black print culture, small literary magazines, and African imagination. He has many publications, just run through a few of them. Childhood in Contemporary Diasporic African Literature, Memories and Futures Past. That's the title of a book published by Palgrave in 2020. He has another book which he co-edited, the Spoken Word Project, Stories Traveling Through Africa. It was published in 2014. He has published many essays. Just give us some examples. Childhoods in Purple Hibiscus, In the Name of the Sun, Fatherhood's Critical Illegitimacy, Songhoods, and the Masculinities in Chris Abani's Graceland and the Virgin of Flames. So has an essay titled Dialogic Childhoods, Chronotopicity in Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's Half of a Yellow Sun. And he's also a short story writer. Short story titled The Blossom, The Wither, and was published in the Amistad in 2006. The fourth discussant today is Akintela, Dr. Akintela. He is a lecturer at the University of English, University of Ibadan. His area of interest, research and teaching, discourse analysis, pragmatics, literary stylistics. It's published an essay titled Metaphoric Representations with Electoral Events in Selected Nigerian Post-Election Speeches and the Humor Generation and Multimodal Framing of Political Actors in the 2015 Nigerian presidential election campaign memes. The final but not the least discussant is Joya Rice. Rice is an English professor at the Department of English at St. Louis University in Missouri, where she teaches African and post-colonial literature and film. Her academic interests, African literature, culture, literature, post-colonial studies. She's written many books. Give us some of them. The first one, This is No Place for a Woman. Nadine Godima, Nayantara Sagar, Buche Mecheta, and the Politics of Gender. This was published in 2000. She has another one titled In the Jaws of the Leviathan Genocide Fiction and Film, published in 2010, and The Writing That Breaks Stones, African Child Soldier Narratives, published in 2020. Also written numerous articles on narratives about migrant African children, religious violence in South Asian cinema, and the magic realism in child soldier movies, among other topics. Found one essay quite interesting, Learning How to Smile Again, Ebola, Resilience, and Sierra Leonean Fiction. She assisted Gobi Haji, a Somalian woman, to write Makalangu, Memoirs of an African Woman. And she also has an essay titled Exile, Diaspora in Abdul Razak, Ghana's Paradise, and Blaweos, We Need New Names. She's a former president of African Literature Association. So we have specialists who are going to help us throw light on the representations in contemporary. Each discussant is going to have 10 minutes. And I'm going to start with on the program. So we're going to start with Daniel Chukwemeka.
Yes, it's online.
Yes. So please, you have 10 minutes to make your presentation.
Okay, good morning. Sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you clearly.
Okay, I'm trying to turn on my video. I don't know if I can do that. Okay, thank you for the opportunity to be part of this roundtable. I want to speak briefly on the theme of, I like to call it when childhood is not the opposite of adulthood, which I identify as a thread that runs through, it runs, quite compellingly through Adesola's representations of child soldiers in contemporary African narratives. One of the book's most urgent provocations is its assertion that the prevailing humanitarian model of childhood, particularly the version that defines the child in opposition to the adult, offers a conceptually flimsy and politically hazardous framework for understanding the lives of young people associated with armed conflict. So, to quote Adesola directly, childhood, essentialized as all that adulthood is not, is conceptually and otherwise inadequate for making sense of the sociopolitical lives of young persons associated with fighting forces, unquote. Now, that line, that line alone calls into question decades of humanitarian advocacy and literary scholarship. And importantly, that line reframes the very subject of childhood as an innocent category violated by war, but as a socially constructed label deployed to manage how we talk about youth in precarious and militarized conditions. So, while reading this very important work, I find myself in agreement with Adesola that this dominant frame, that is what he calls the humanitarian and human rights discourse, tends to, it tends to like flatten out uh, the heterogeneity of experiences, right? Of childhood experiences, because it insists on a sentimental reading of child soldiers as victims and as beings who are acted upon, right? Rather than actors in their own right? So, okay, for example, on page 10 of the book, Adesola writes that the quote, it says, the obsession with childhood as synonymous with innocence and agentic incapacity predominates, unquote. So this framing, which privileges the child as becoming rather than being, all right, leaves room, it leaves little room, according to Adesola, which I agree with, for political and social complexity of the children involved in armed groups. So one of the most striking insights in the book is that um, many protagonists in child soldier narratives are, quote, only children because they are so described, unquote. That's quite simplistic, right? I agree. So their thoughts, choices, and strategies for survival often defy the stereotypical assumptions embedded in the Western idea of childhood, namely innocence, immaturity, vulnerability, name them. So, in fact, Adesola knows that such protagonists are often reluctant to, quote, recover, unquote, the childhood that humanitarian therapists insist they have lost. So, childhood here functions not as a lived experience, but as a conceptual ideal imposed from outside. So, where I think the book really, really, really shines is in its sustained efforts to unmask the ideology of lost innocence and to show how idea shapes the structure and risk of African narratives, especially those that circulate widely in the global south. Deshola's argument is big genre in which the Western humanitarian imaginary gets rehearsed, that is often through trauma, therapy, redemption, is astute, quite astute. So, yeah. So, fictional works, according to Adesola, often operate within the same logics that inform NGOs like Save the Children, which include the loss of innocence, the victim status, and the presumed need for rehabilitation. So, however, while I am convinced by the book's rigorous critique of the universalist model of childhood, I really wish that I had paused at some point, even if briefly, to acknowledge the affective and perhaps like political utility of that same model, right? So for yeah, I mean, for all its simplifications. Modern ideology of childhood has, as we know over time, allowed for the articulation of global outrage. I mean, it has served, however imperfectly, as the basis for mobilizing resources, advancing legal protections, and bringing certain kinds of violence into international visibility. And so let me put it this way. Um, the idea that children everywhere deserve to be shielded from the horrors of war, may be naive, even culturally imperial, but it is not, I think, entirely without ethical value. On page 8, Adesola rightly observes that, quote, the modern ideology of childhood insists on the homogeneity of childhood. That is, the assumption that children everywhere share the same essential traits. And it downplays the significance of cultural and social diversities as possible sources for the constructions of childhoods, unquote. I totally agree, but I would have welcomed an additional gesture that said, this ideology is both a blunt instrument and a moral resource, that kind of thing. You know why? Because it obscures difference, yes, but it also affirms, however selectively, the notion that some violences are universally intolerable. My point here is not to rescue that, I don't mean to like rescue that ideology. I am not interested in that, but to complicate our relationship to that ideology, right? As it stands, the book risks suggesting that there is nothing to be salvaged in this humanitarian script, which may undercut its own call for plural and context-sensitive accounts of childhood. So that said, what I most common in this work is its refusal of easy binaries like childhood versus adult, victim versus like end, trauma versus resilience. Instead, the book charts a more unstable and politically charged middle ground, one in which the child soldier figure disrupts the epistemological foundations of both literature and humanitarianism. The protagonists in the narratives explored by Adesola, like Song for Night, Allah is Not Obliged, King Dog, and so on, the protagonists do not perform childhood as Western discourse expects, nor do they fully inhabit adulthood. They rather exist in a liminal space that exposes the conceptual fragility of both categories. So to me, this is where the book makes its most lasting intervention. It helps us to see childhood not as a stable identity, but as a discursive battleground. And by doing so, the book reorients our attention away from the melodrama of lost innocence and toward the ethical ambiguities of participation, survival, social being, and so on. So it encourages us to ask the question, what are the costs of imagining the child only through trauma and recovery? What do we miss when we deny the political agency of those who are young? And what kind of knowledge might we gain if we treated these children not only as damaged adults in the making,
Daniel, you
but
have two
as
more
actors,
minutes. Daniel,
already negotiating? Yes, I know,
two more
brother,
minutes.
but as I know already. Thank you. But as actors already negotiating complex social worlds. So Adeshola's book offers an important recalibration of how we read child social narratives by challenging the humanitarian habit of interpreting children through moral sentiment rather than social analysis. And it makes space for alternative understandings of childhood that emerge from within African contexts themselves. So, yes, when childhood is no longer the opposite of adulthood, what we get is not confusion, but clarity. Clarity about how power works, categories, how collides with and resists dominant discourses, and how the figure of the child soldier disrupts global hierarchies of innocence, responsibility, and care. Thank you.
Thank you. Now we go on to Ian. You have 10 minutes.
Thank you very much. Thank you, the organizers, for organizing this panel. And I would like to say congratulations to Adesola for writing this very important book and offering us the space and venue for this essential conversation. So my comments, I have titled them, Where Does a Human Become a Thing? On Thingification and African Futurities. Representations of child soldier. So I'll just read my comments and highlight the instances where I would appreciate if the author can provide further insights where necessary. Representation of child soldiers in contemporary African narratives is an important book that weighs in on the thorny question of child soldier portrayals in African literature. At the core of this book's argument is the idea that the image of child soldiering that emerges from recent discourses on African writing is grossly stereotypical, racist, and reductive. The book contends that the simplistic binary that frames the child soldier figure either as innocent victims on the one hand or as irredeemable perpetrators of atrocities on the other is yet another dimension in the long durée of Western scopic regimes that depict Africa and Africans as what Achille Mbembe calls in his book on the post-colony an experience that can only be understood through a negative interpretation. Mbembe further refers to that narrative as an understanding of Africa that is perpetually incomplete, mutilated, unfinished, its history reduced to a series of setbacks of nature in its quest for humankind. Adesola's novel reading of African child soldier narratives anchored on ethno-political conflicts in Sierra Leone, Liberia, Congo-Brazzaville, and Nigeria is intended as a corrective to such stereotypes and their continued perpetuation. My interest in this book is linked to my broader, general research interest in questions of spatiality, materiality, subjectivity, and Africanity, and their connections to global discourses of Blackness. So I'd like to frame my comments in terms of some signifiers that Adesola's book broaches on, which in my view can extend these conversations. These signifiers include the thing, the streets, the bush thing, and lastly, thinginess by association. So first, the thing. An important problematic that representation of child soldiers hints at is the consolidation of the child soldier as an abject, fungible subject in the text that, in scholarship about the text he analyzes. This narrative of fungibility and thinginess emerges a number of times in the book. In one instance, in the discussion of what the author refers to as strategic agency for the child figure, the author's Adesola is commenting on the power dynamics between a particular character, Agu, in Uzodi Maiwela's Beast of No Nation, and his superior, Commandant. And he says, and I quote, "To Commandant, Agu is not a human being. He is the thing, an object that is meant to be used and discarded when it's no longer needed." What follows is Adesola's discussion of how Agu's thinginess emerges from Beast of No Nation. He says, and I quote, "The first question Commandant poses to his group when he sets eyes on Agu for the first time is, quote, 'Who is finding this thing? Why is this thing here on the ground?' No one answers him, but Striker, another character who is returning from the truck to join the group, is met with the same question, quote, "Is this you finding this thing?" Still locked in the understanding of the new boy as a consumable, Commandant asks Striker, "Are you trying to eat this one or what?" Adesola continues by saying that it is as a thing that Commandant relates to Agu, possessing the boy and making him live at his commands and whims. Excuse me. So as the book, Adesola succinctly highlights and concludes, Agu's agency is severely circumscribed. He is a thing that exists at the pleasure of its owner. He also cites Orlando Patterson's discussion in the book Slavery and Social Debt to highlight the fact that Agu is subsumable under the category of socially dead people, similar to those of enslaved people in the New World. We can extrapolate from here that Agu's fungibility, his thinginess, negates the possibility of any relation that is not explicitly death-oriented, to use the words of Joanna McElligott in her discussion of representations of Black life in the slave-era American South. These words are even more relevant when we consider the relationship that Agu has with his gun. Adesola writes, and I quote, "He, and now his commandant, rates weapons more valuable than young soldiers like Agu, who comprise his ragtag army. Agu says that in the group, everybody is making sure he's having his own gun or knife, because if you're losing his commandant's gun or knife, then commandant will be losing you. Agu remains acutely conscious of the degraded value as a human in comparison of his degraded value in comparison with guns. Gone away in the bush, but as gone is more important than me. I am always remembering this." The point to note here is that fungi soldiers such as Agu have become the representation that is of humanness. When Agu says, "I am throwing gun away," then Rambo will be throwing me away because gun is more important than me. He is articulating his positionality as a marker of abjection oriented towards violent death. It is also interesting that not only Agu, commandants consider Agu in that way, but Agu himself has internalized that conception, because as Adesola explains later, quotes, "On several occasions, Agu laments that he is unable to decide command because he's end of." So Adesola's analysis of Agu as a fungible, abject character raises for me a number of questions. For example, what does this imposition of thinginess mean for Agu and other similar figures for his stand-in? Why does it occur and why? And more importantly, if, as Adesola argues, echoing David Masty, that child soldier narratives provide a view of African histories, politics and cultures, and day-to-day realities that seem familiar to readers insofar as they complement existing narratives and thinking about Africa in North America, then how does the consolidation of the child soldier as an abject figure impact our understanding broader narratives of subjectivity and representation of life on the continent? Another aspect that hopefully I want to address more in view of time during the comments is Adesola's conception of the streets as the avenue where the thingness of the child soldier figure begins. So I move then to the next signifier, the bush thing. Although Adesola offers us a positive view of the would-be child soldier's decision to take to the streets as an exercise, I would like to him to think about how we can understand the forms of diminution that begin in the streets for the child, but proceeds as a form of negative transformation. It appears that the streets are the site of the beginning of a fragmentation that would eventually transform the human child into the objects of human thing. I would like to conclude with a number of pertinent that the child figure raise way to the idea of thinking about association. Is this form of thinginess that Agu embodies contagious? Is the becoming thin condition of the child soldier transmissible onto other similarly positioned marginal figures who, having been narrated as thingified aberrations within a system of imaginary significations, can then be consigned to death? Moreover, if the becoming thin process of a child figure begins in the streets and gets consolidated in the bush and then becomes cemented in narrative, to what extent is rehumanization, both literal and discursive, possible? And here I'm not just referring to the possibility of restitution or reincorporation of the child into the society. What I mean here is something that is of greater stakes. To what extent are the discourses and narrative underpinning our understanding of the child soldier figure redeemable? These questions are very pertinent given our global current economy, where thingification is usually one step in the trajectory that ends in elimination. As Chimamanda Adichie says in her talk, The Danger of a Single Story, show a people as one thing and only one thing over and over, and this is what they become. Adesola prompts us to think about what this dilemma means for our understanding of African futurity through the figure of the child soldier. And I want to stop here. Thank you.
Give us his presentation.
Can you hear me?
Yes, please make your presentation.
Thank you.
You have 10 minutes.
All right, thank you. All right, thank you. Thank you to the panelists and obviously mostly to Ademola for this wonderful book. Ademola Adesola's book, Representations of Child Soldiers in Contemporary African Narratives, is the latest in a growing stable of recent monographs on childhood studies in relation to Africa. More recent titles include Sarah Duff's Childhood and Youth in African History, my own book, Childhood in Contemporary African Literature, Memories and Futures Past, and Joya Raise's Writing That Breaks Stories, African Child Soldier Narratives. And a view of this list would include books that work with the analytic contemporary in relation to various concepts and themes in African literary and cultural production. And this would include Madhu Krishnan's Pre-African English, Globalizations, Post-Colonial Identifications. The theme of Adesola's book on child soldiers can also be read in generative ways as adjacent to other recent books that engage with the context of war, memory, and genocide, such as Chibo and Arthur Nyaruba's The Post-Colonial Genocide novel, as well as Adebayo Sakiru's Continuous Past, Frictions of Memory in Post-Colonial Africa. Now, this growing list of books gives conceptual life to the category contemporary, its connections with theoretical temporalities of the post-colonial and diasporic, as well as in the way that I argue in my book, ways in which a particular generation of African writers can find critical characterization. Adesola's book focuses on the specific subjectivity of child soldiers, the context of child soldiering, and the representational economies that arise from it, to put forward a critique of the ways in which these narratives further centuries-long stereotypes of what Alta Jablow and Dorothy Hammond formulated as the Africa that never was, that Hegelian land of childhood undergirded by chaos, violence, and irrational order from an imperial economy of imagination that has lasted for more than half a millennium. The specific context of Adesola's book makes visible the contemporary guises of this age-old problem, building on the broader and interdisciplinary scholarship on child soldiers by Alcinda Honwana, David Rosen, Peter Singer, Jimmy Briggs, Romeo Dallaire, Miriam Daynov, Mark Drumble, Donald Danson, Julie McBride, Susan Shepler, and a host of others. Adesola's book intervenes through his argument that human rights in the global imagination create regressive conditions of possibility for the imagination of child soldiers by both contemporary African writers and by former child soldiers themselves. Adesola makes the argument in Foucauldian fashion about what it means for human rights discourses to exert their own power in not only the representational economy of child soldiering, but also the critical enterprise that emerges out of it. Both these dimensions continue to further an Africa that never was, Adesola argues. An Africa rid of the complexity of childhood experience, one which is read ahistorically, with that symptomatic Jamesonian political unconscious, with a kind of post-colonial exoticism presented by Graham Hagan as undergirding the foundational conceit of modern African literature. In a sense, Adesola is asking us in this book to examine child soldiering not through the political unconscious, but through what Neil Lazarus elsewhere formulates as the post-colonial unconscious. In other words, if we expand the primary field of child experience without the context of war, which other stories would emerge to change the aspect of human rights as an over-determining interpretive context? Adesola sets his poetry in motion with a set of questions, and I quote, "What ideas about children and soldiering do African representations of child soldiers convey? To what degree are these representations attuned to the historical and political specificities of the context within which wars involving the use of children occur? What are the representational strategies adopted by writers in their attempts to shape an image of child soldiers? What is the significance of these works? Audiences they type. What messages do the paratexts and places of publication of these works communicate about their settings? Do these works revise or reinforce stereotypical images of Africa? With these questions, Adesola underlines the ways representations of child soldiering, as well as the existing critical enterprise, all fall into the abyss of dehistoricization and decontextualization of childhood experiences. Quite rightly, he argues for how critics and the authors of these of an economy of the spectacular, one fueled and meant to also fuel the perception of humanitarian intervention. In other words, there are ways in which the objective of humanitarian intervention is processed through of the spectacular imaginaries of child soldiers, and so the creation of a prototype figure who is interchangeable in a dehistoricized and uncartographical context. No, Africa is a country. In this way, Adesola argues for the ways in which these humanitarian discourses make more visible a narrative of a disrupted Edenic childhood innocence, one which is adulterated by war and which requires Western frameworks of correction. In other words, the power view of human rights, its interventive practice, its conceptual patenting, belongs in the Western front and must now be rolled out to return these figures into innocence. Adesola demonstrates this through not only the imaginative subjectivities of the fictional figures, but also in those of the autobiographies of child soldiers. In addition, Adesola demonstrates in the penultimate chapter of this book this paratextual economy of imagination shaped and curated through the intersection of Western publishing, economy, and formats, and form what Joseph Slaughter called elsewhere Human Rights Incorporated. Adesola selects Uzodin Maiwela's Beasts of No Nation, Chris Abani's Song for Night, Amadou Kourouma's Allah Is Not Obliged, Emmanuel Dongala's Johnny Madog, as representative of various dimensions of this figure in variation to the power of human rights discourse. He puts these works of fiction in conversation with the autobiographies of China Ketesi, amongst other actual child soldiers. Adesola argues for the ways in which the fictional accounts fall into a pattern of imagination in which stories of suffering are meant to meet the expectations of Western human rights agencies, journalists, and aid agents. In this way, Adesola reads the ways in which, especially Weala and Dongala, present narratives that read the child soldier of a moral consciousness, making them automatons in this context of war, devoid of a history of adulteration themselves before the war. These narratives, Adesola argues, are crafted through a reductive presentism, a kind of zombification of childhood, a reading that Adesola maintains in his analysis of the film adaptation of Iweala's novel by Kari Fukunaga. Adesola rightly reads the ways in which Chris Abani's Song for Night creates the child soldier as a product of the aesthetic hybridity, one whose position of address to the reader complicates spatial and temporal locations. He speaks from the dead back into the living present, and with a much more complex moral, ethical, and political consciousness. Abani's My Luck addresses us with a specific linguistic authority embodied and effective in ways that refuse to binarize childhood and adulthood, peacetime and wartime, innocence and adulteration, in the ways that discourse shape other narratives. In addition, Adesola's reading of Nkuruma's Allies Not Obliged makes visible the layers of historical complexity and adulterated childhood experiences that the protagonist comes with before the war, as well as the historical hypertexts that give the reader an exploded, as opposed to a narrow view beyond that of the theatrical space of war. It is therefore just as well that Adesola rounds off in his penultimate chapter with a materialist analysis using the concept of the paratext to extend our thinking about the economy of the imagination that undergirds child soldiers. I'm reminded here of the prestige economy of literary and cultural imagination, broadly speaking, especially studies on narratives of Africa that are designed and prefigured for specific literary prizes set up in Europe and North America. And I'm going to conclude. All in all, Adesola's representations of child soldiers, Adesola's book, Representations of Child Soldiers in Contemporary African Narratives, maps this critical field substantially and judicially, engaging with critics who have written on these novels and the broader field of representation in contemporary African literary criticism, including, of course, Joseph Slaughter, Eleni Kondoriotis, Akachi Ezegbo, amongst others. This field of primary interlocution is particularly well executed in the book and will, in my opinion, be an excellent model in the ethics and citational practices of mapping a field. In conclusion, I have just a few questions that I'm going to put on the table for Adesola. And these questions do not in any way take away from what I think is an important piece of scholarship in the broader field of contemporary African literary studies. One, could Adesola comment on whether the stakes of representation, as you see in these narratives, vary in terms of their generic format? The representational economies of works of fiction might differ from those of the autobiographies, even though I see that you tend to read them in equal footing. In what ways do different genres create conditions of possibility for how they're going to be read or how they're going to circulate? Number two, do you think that perhaps your reading of the overdetermination of a human rights discourse in these narratives might be influenced by the autobiographical fallacy presented by the biographies of actual child soldiers, which tend to dominate the interdisciplinary scholarship on child soldiers in Africa? Number three, in your argument, you fault the ways in which some of these fictional writers refuse to name the specific places and geographies of these child soldiers, while you rightly argue that this can give the impression of Africa as a country. Could we also see this as the author's activation of a poetic freedom that refuses to exceptionalize certain countries as stereotypical of child soldiering histories? And finally, and I'll stop here, could you comment on whether you see any alternative future of this subgenre of child soldiers? Where do you think it's going? How is it going to allow us to theorize African statehood, for instance, which is the big problem here? How nation states devolve into states of war. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Uma. Now move on. Dr. Keller.
It's not here. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Professor Rising, it is your turn. You have 10 minutes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. Thank you. So I want to start out by saying that I'm very grateful for the opportunity to speak here. And I also wanted to, so thank you very much to the organizers of this conference. I also wanted to say that it was an absolute pleasure reading Adesola's book. And a lot has already been said by my illustrious colleagues who preceded me. I will just restrict myself to several short comments, and then we can open it up for more. So I guess I'm going to call my reading of his book, Why an Analysis of Ademola Adesola's Representations of Child Soldiers, or Why Humanitarian Discourse, Eurocentric humanitarian discourse and Western notions of childhood innocence are harmful, because I think that is sort of the main thrust of his book. I'll just read my comments. Adesola's sophisticated critique of Eurocentric humanitarian discourse and the harm it causes is one of the most attractive features of the book to me. I do agree to a certain extent with Daniel Chukwuemeka's critique of that, but I do also believe that Adesola sort of answers some of that critique in the book also. I will say that in my view, Adesola's focus is unique in that it centers on the ways in which child soldier narratives featuring African children showcase problematic definitions of childhood. So in other words, having read a lot of critiques myself, very fine ones, I found it very refreshing to read a book in which the focus is more on how childhood is represented rather than other sort of generic and other difference. Others, for example, them are named in his book, such as scholar I admire, Eleni Kondoriotis, tend to focus on genre and generic differences between various narratives. For example, she has written a very fine book about the African war novel, and myself included, several others have looked at child soldier narrative in terms of how the genre itself is different from, say, war novels and other things. There is much less work that has been done on the particular focus that Adesola writes about, and that is how childhood is actually represented. And I'm speaking, scientists have studied. They haven't studied it in the specific context of child soldier narratives. And I'll just quote one section of Adesola's book here. He said, child soldier protagonists are only children because they are so described. Their thoughts and actions contradict many of the assumptions and meanings standardly resident within the appellation of children and challenge its essences, that is, vulnerability, immaturity, and innocence, unquote. And so basically what he's getting at there is that these three adjectives, a child is vulnerable, is immature, and is innocent, underlie most of our notions, accepted notions of what a child is. And he's asking us to question that in the context of children who have already been, if you want to use the word, corrupted by both by war and prior to war. So to me, that's one of the first values of this book. Whether we agree entirely with his critique of that notion, the fact that he raises the question to me is important. The second thing I have to say is that Adesola frames this critique in a fairly unique way. Rather than suggest that the African child soldier novel depicts human rights violations, which of course it does, and which has been the primary focus of most scholars writing about this topic, he suggests that the discourse that shapes the notions of human rights itself needs to be questioned. So basically, he's asking us to rethink our very questions. So that to me is very valuable. Another scholar I admire, such as Alcinda Honwana, has done very valuable groundwork on the topic already. She is a social scientist, after all, and not a literary scholar. And therefore, the primary focus for such scholars tends to be is how child soldiers' human rights are violated and what we can do about them. I realize that that is not the focus of most literary scholars, but I've already spoken about them in my first point. So what I will say is that this book, Adesola, shows how Eurocentric discourse that shapes the narrative of violations are possibly created some reality. So my point here is not that he is saying that we should do away with a discussion of human rights, or that human rights violations are not serious crime, but he is saying that the narrative around human rights and about their violations needs to be thought. So in that sense, I find this to be a very thought-provoking book. And I'll again quote from a section of his book. He writes, quote, "The African child soldier genre can be described as a collection of narratives engaged in the sentimental presentation of the childish innocence of their young narrators, far more than the actual warriors. It is the idealized innocence of the supposed childhood of the young combatants that occupies a central place in them, just as in the humanitarian NGOs' campaigns against child soldiering," unquote. And having written a book on the topic myself, and having actually interviewed on a very albeit in a very limited way, former child soldiers myself, I couldn't agree more, because the one thing that I did find repeated over and over again in the course of my own research is that rehabilitation programs have failed in many instances. So in other words, former child soldiers may have been, there may have been interventions that have gotten them out of danger zones and action combat, but rehabilitating them back into society has not worked very well across the board. And although I'm not saying that depictions of childhood innocence are the primary reason, there is a sense that if sort of a before, when the rhetoric is driven by a sort of before and after idea, that before combat the child soldier was innocent after combat he is corrupted and needs to be brought back to that innocence, then any attempt to rehabilitate child soldiers is sort of doomed to failure, in my view. And I cannot underscore enough how the actual situation on the ground does reflect that dilemma. Of course, there are a lot of other factors, such as how many resources are going into that rehabilitation process, what the cultural dynamics in specific countries are. But nevertheless, I do think that the point he raises here is valuable there. The third point I'll raise about the book as a whole is his reading of individual novels. So as a literary scholar, that is the part that appeals to us the most. And my reaction to that is that his close readings of individual novels is by and large incisive. He explains that an inaccurate representation is not what we as literary scholars usually think of. In other words, previous scholars such as Mark Sanders and myself included have looked, when we look for inaccuracies or inadequacies in a literary text, we tend to focus on things like stylistics, right? How is it stylistically unsophisticated? Is it factually incorrect? But what Adesola shows us is that what he calls, if you like, inadequate representations are the word he uses is lopsided. He critiques the ways in which a text co-opts prevailing notions of childhood innocence or disrupts prevailing notions. And to take up an example that was mentioned earlier, he critiques Beasts of No Nation because, as he says, quote, Agu as a child soldier, to analyze Agu as a child soldier without paying attention to the militarized logics and ideas he has imbibed from the Bible before his conscription is to make him seem a blameless victim of supervening adult agencies. Agu's enthrallment with the biblical David act of violence against the Philistine Goliath may be thought of as mirroring childhood immaturity, but in fact, a positive reception of David's act by the adults around him, especially his own mother, challenges such a view. So in other words, what he is pointing out here is that even before conscription, the child soldiers in the texts that he analyzes, such as Agu, for example, are presented as innocent before combat. And what Adesola is getting us to see is that in reality, such children have been as innocent as they are made out to be, even before war touches their lives. So I'll leave my three main points to that. The only questions or critiques that I have of it are some that have been already echoed. I do think genre matters, and I think those generic differences were not examined in as much detail as I would like. For example, there is a difference between a child soldier memoir and a child soldier novel, and those differences are quite substantial. Aside from anything else, since Adesola does talk about the context, I think he calls them this a specific word he uses for that, but context matters. And in the public sphere, as he mentions Joseph Slaughter, for example, in the public sphere, memoirs tend to have a different resonance than fiction does. And in my own analysis, I have found that the lay public tends to regard memoirs, rightly or wrongly, as more open to scrutiny for factual inaccuracies, whereas novels get no such scrutiny. We tend to look at novels, at least the lay public tends to regard novels more as things that they would read for, edification. So when there are two different ways in the public, I'll conclude the public sphere. The fact that the two genres are written differently, the fact that they are received differently, should be analyzed a bit more. And I'll end there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Wright. Before we on to all the opportunity to make my ask my question. Is asking readers to enlarge their vision. It's like a self-conscious artist who is doing self-criticism. So to really understand that text, I think we have to reckon with both narrators. Okay. Now, Kuli and the other guy. Yes. You reject. I mean, you simply reject explanations for using the two narrator strategy. The first one, that it enables the novelist to avoid a simplistic representation, the child soldier. And the second one, that it humanizes the child soldier. I want to go along with MacLeod that by using that two narrative strategy, Ungala wants us to, see the drama from the point of view of the villain, and also from the point of view of the victim. Okay? And it's amazing that the lady who is sensitive, she kills bad dog. So violence again, corrective violence, quite all right, but it is still violence. That's the first point I want to make. Then you said somewhere that Jethro is reluctant to kill. To kill who? So David, of course, kills Goliath, and the Christians are enamored of that act. But when it comes to the enemy, they reject violence, they condemn violence, but they seem to, be enthusiastic about David, man of God, killing Goliath. They use that story, whereas it promotes violence. It's like initiating children into the world of violence. But this Jethro killing, I don't know who. The United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, 1989, and the 1924 Declaration of Human Rights. So these documents, they are presenting the ideal. I know that you are not dealing with the ideal. You are dealing with what is, the thing as it is, reality as it is. But they are looking at what should be the ideal. So those two documents need to be considered as documents that are trying to give us an ideal situation in which to raise children in the world. But that is not your own engagement. Your engagement is what is there, what is the reality on the ground. Finally, these child soldier narratives, what can we learn from them in Africa? Okay? What can we take away from them? I know that if we're able to solve the problems of underdevelopment in Africa, then we'll be able to overcome this Afro-pessimism, because all our texts, they are all pessimistic. Does Africa have a future at all? It seems as if instead of our situation improving, we are retrogressing. Even countries that have immense opportunities to make it, like Nigeria. Look at how much Nigeria is wasting on fratricide, brothers killing brothers, wasting resources. So, and these child soldier narratives, can we learn something from them? What can we take away from questions I have? Thank you. We'll give you 20 minutes. Oh, no, 20. Is that's 15? I can do 10. All right, 10.
First, thanking the LSA to have this discussion on the book. I express my heartfelt gratitude this conference, who found the time to engage. I want to thank you for that investment. I do not take it lightly. I so much thank you for the labor. I know how busy people can get. Found the time to be here. I think I largely agreed with most of your conclusions regarding your engagement with book. And you raise many, many crucial points that for me, I think the best way to make sense of provocations that you have. Okay, so I was saying that the best way to make a good use of the provocations that you have articulated, take them away to the degree that the internet, the platform we're using allowed me able to, hear some things I couldn't hear a couple of others. I will go back to the recording once we're done with the conference, and I would with that. I have very limited, minutes, and I want to just touch on a few things to the extent that time permits me. I think the best place to start go to, the interesting point that Joya was making about the distinction between memoirs and, of course, fictions. And if you look at the title of the book itself, quite consciously and deliberately, the word narratives, is used because I want to gesture to the fact that while my primary focus are novels, I am also reading them in comparison with their non-fictional counterparts, more specifically life narratives such as memoirs. And so what I found in my engagement with these two supposedly distinct, they had distinct to a very large extent. Only you are even looking at, their takeoff points. I mean, one is by somebody who has had experience, and the other is a product of recreation in that sense. And so we can, there's a lot of scholarship on this, which I don't want to, I believe we all know. But what is important here is that in my own engagement with the child soldier memoirs, as well as novels, I struggle to find a clear and marked difference in the substance of their representation. It would seem to me, as my research revealed, that the line between novels and memoirs with regard to African child soldier narratives, it's a blade line, thinness. Because most of the memoirists, take liberty to do exactly what a novelist would do. And I know this is one of the biggest criticisms against life writings, in that sense. Take, for example, A Long Way Gone by the so-called celebrity former child soldier of Sierra Leone, Ishmael Bear. There is a huge contestation around whether he even experienced the thing he experienced. In addition to that, is also the image of Africa. That you find in this one. It's an Africa that you struggle to find in reality, and which is not different from what is happening in some of the novels. So for me, I struggle to see, a significant difference in the nature of, Africa. That is, of course, the subject of, the text. And of course, that will not be without a reason if we look at why they are not so much different. Both forms and the story they tell want to cater to an audience. And the best way to do that is actually to give the audience what they want. And as some of you do know, not one of the former child soldiers who have successfully been moved abroad and have written their memoirs live on the continent, and none of those works are in that, sense. So they know the audience they're writing for, and they cater to that very seriously, and they write to fit, that, expectation. In that case, the way some of the memoirs are structured, it's not different from the ways in which the story of the so-called lost boys of Sudan happened, especially at the Kakuma camp in Kenya. So that was a point where they were going to be to various places, particularly the US. And so the US officials would interview these kids and want to know what their stories were. And the first set of, kids that were rejected. And these young fellows were wondering, what did we not get right? Until the second batch went. And amongst the second batch were people who didn't even experience any hardship. And then they were their imagination was very fertile. And they cook up stories about how they have lost this, how they have done that. And that made, that resonated with the US officials. And those kids, got approved, for airlifting. And when they went back, they told them what they said. And from then on, that person went up. Even if you had some experience, you speak exaggeratedly, of it in a shocking, and disturbing manner. And that's for being moved abroad. So some of these memoirs work as well. I also want to, talk about this other important point that has been stressed. And it's been put the way that I want, except that there are a few things that were raised with regard to, and that is the humanitarian discourse, the human rights and humanitarian discourse itself. Well, for me, I am not interested in asking us to entirely jettison the discourse or humanitarian effort in itself. In fact, I do think that the work that humanitarian agencies do is quite very important. But when the focus is places like Africa, it's placed terribly differently in a sense that the understanding of this, especially as evident in their discourse, is quite incredibly narrow. For somebody who wants to do a work of care, a work of salvation, a work of rehabilitation, the sense in which they understand the field and the humans they're going to deal with is extremely, one that is, entrenched in misunderstanding and misrepresentation. Take, for example, as I argue in chapter, 3, when the subject is rehabilitation, the demobilization and rehabilitation program that they design, you find out that they proceed from this position that the loss of innocence in children of war is what happened only because they get conscripted. But in my own, even in the account, as it is in the memoir, the fact that loss of innocence happened prior to enlistment as a result of very precarious socioeconomic conditions and just many other things. So that whatever is not finished of innocence prior to enlistment is what is finished off through enlistment. Now, if that understanding is taken, it has implications for the rehabilitation program that will be designed. Because if you do know that the pre-war society is quite problematic in its socioeconomic conditioning, and you are not addressing that, rehabilitation will not work in that sense. Factors that predispose children to be instrumentalized as, soldiers would, still, if they are not addressed, they will still throw these folks into this same thing. So you then find out that, as if these organizations themselves know, most of the very fine work they have done around rehabilitation, most of the individuals they have so demobilized and rehabilitated, they took them outside. So that would mean for rehabilitation to work, it may start somewhere on the continent, but it has to, be completed elsewhere for it to be effective. And for me, this also has implication for government across the, continent, because the question that was raised by the chair was, what is the value of this work, to us here? It is. We are seeing, and we have seen over time, the NGOization of development on the continent. And my argument is that NGOs cannot develop any country. Their role, I've refused to understand, is one of complement. It's complementary. They are to complement the biggest agency of development, which is the government. So that NGOs externally making inroads into the spaces on the continent and seeking to develop, it's a waste of everybody's time. In fact, we have now seen in the literature, they even spend, if they have $10 to spend in a particular country, about 70% money goes into logistics. The actual want to do on the ground. So there is something that I am not rejecting the effort of humanitarian organizations, but I am calling attention to understanding how they understand the phenomenon that they are engaged with. And some of these texts, some of these novels also question in that regard. And in so doing is where the value of this text. I'll make one. There's sort of things that I could address here, but I'll make one more point. Who talks about the nameless, of setting in some of this work? For me, I also think while, yes, the authors have the liberty, to shape and construct their work how they will, over time, as we have seen in African literature, and how people outside of Africa respond to this, text. Namelessness allows thinking of that Africa that does not exist, that undistinguishable Africa, which is one that is homogeneous, one that has. So that if you're reading a particular text, in which case there are clues and ideas that this is an African space, context becomes fungible. I'll give you one example here, which is some of the things I pointed out in my chapter 5 where I read paratext. So you find out that a particular cover design of a book has the picture, famously, the picture of the child soldier on the image of Ishmael Bell's A Long Way Gone, the memoir, which in publishing, it's not the case. It's never been the case. There are about 43 editions of that book, and all of them from different publishers. They use the same image. What is interesting about that image is that it was taken in a country that has no history of child soldiery. So, and I do think that, namelessness do this kind of work as well. And that's why, I raised that point. I mean, there are quite a number of people here that not in your discussion of this book. As I said, I would, give my attention. But more again, I want to thank you for the time and the attention that you gave to this work.
Thank you. Now, we open to the audience here and online. Please, those are online. Anybody wants to ask a question or anybody? Please, yeah, Toluwani, right? Thank you very much for that question. Yeah, Chris did raise that actually about representation of Africa as homogeneous space, and this is something that I engage with quite very much in the book because the Africa of this text is that undistinguishable Africa. Uh, for example, Ghana is not different from Nigeria, as it is, other places not different from the rest. It's just one homogeneous, space. And you see, that's not difficult to understand because again, the concept of childhood itself, as Professor Adekoya, the chair, mentioned earlier, referencing such instruments as the Convention on the Right of the Child, the 1989 document, which attempts to define what a child is. What you find in that document is a universalization of the notion of childhood. So that, for example, even in Nigeria alone here, there is no single idea of childhood. The way the Yoruba people describe their young ones or categorize their young ones, it's not the same thing as Igbo people do, or Hausa people, or any other folks. Just within Nigeria alone, how much more on the continent? But in the document, the CRC, what you have is that to the question, who or what is a child? A child is anyone below 18. See, childhood is defined, therefore, from the point of view of age and biology. But as I argue in my own work, the actions undertaken if innocence means lack of adult experience. And then we now have young folks who have killed, who have engaged in sexual violence, who have done all kinds of atrocities. Yes, biologically and by chronological age, they remain children, but in terms of undertakings, they operate in adult domains. Therefore, insisting that they are still children is questionable. You have to pay attention to what they are doing to be able to, and I think it was Daniel who also put it very, clearly that we can also think of these figures as liminal beings so that they are heterogeneous in the way they operate and they don't answer to that one way of understanding them. As it is, there is no one way of understanding anything on the African continent. It's diverse, it's heterogeneous. And those differences or nuances must be minded meaningful to be able to understand anything there. That's, um, absolutely.
thank you, Dominic, for that question. Dominic's question is that the figure of the child has been laid to Africa. It's not, or has not been used for Western intervention. My simple answer, and again, as I have, stressed in the book, is it's just that. It does vary that. It's an excuse. It's been used as an excuse for Western intervention. And for those of us who are mindful of what goes on in different theater of wars around the world today, there is no best time to exist to understand Western hypocrisy than now. Very, very useful for us to understand if we have not paid attention previously. And I give you a very quick short story about how in the name of the child, different atrocities get committed, different distortions get done, and whatnot. So from what we have seen, and in my own research, I found out that Westerners, in an attempt to, when they seek to intervene in spaces like Africa, in Africa dealing with child soldier issue, they often conclude, oh, any presence of children in warfare can only be interpreted as victimization, as abuse. It can't be any other thing. So we have to intervene. That is, when the targets of child soldiers in African contexts are Africans, there is always the urge on the part of Westerners to intervene and say, let's rescue these children. However, when the target of these kids, these child soldiers, are Westerners, those kids cease to be children. They treat them as adults. And I'll give you one example. There was a case of Omar Kadar, a Canadian, citizen. He was the first person, non-white person, to kill a U.S. Marine in Afghanistan. He was under 18 when he did that. And when they arrested him, guess where they took him to? They took him to Guantanamo Bay, to be in prison. He was under 18. Recall that his counterparts were attacking their own people. They are victims of those people. They are not perpetrators. But because the target of Omar Kadar is a U.S. Marine, he ceases to be a child and is processed as an adult, in that regard. So if you want to read about it, it's online. Different scholars have also written about this. This is something, that is quite interesting. And it goes on. It's so excuses are always, always, always constructed to be able to do whatever they want to do. And please, let's also understand that when we're talking about these human categories, we are talking about social construction. A child, an adult, whatever you are calling it, it's constructed, and that's why 11:59 p.m., you can be 17 years old, and by 12 a.m., when you clock 18, you're an adult now. You're a young adult. Right.
Well, I just want to express deep gratitude to all the discussants, to the author of the book, to our audience, online, and thanks, everybody.
Yeah, Joey, and I'll see you in Kenya in a few days' time.
Yeah.
All
right, bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you.